Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I'm YuGiOh, and today I'm going to be doing a tier list for post-Phantom Nightmare meta. So as you can see, this is our tier list. We have a bunch of the decks here. Unlike other people, it's a lot more condensed. I wanted to focus more on the relevant decks to the format instead of just putting a bunch of stuff in which might see fringe regional play or locals tops. Again, if the deck is not represented here, I'm not saying it's a bad deck, I'm just saying it's probably not going to be competitive enough to have an impact in the format. So, as you can see here, we have the tier 0.5, which there's a reason for why this is a tier on here. We have tier 1, tier 1.5, and tier 2. So, let's get started. Starting things off with the reason for tier 0.5. I'm going to put the new Snake Eyes Fire King deck. So, post Phantom Nightmare, you get Populous and Promethean Princess, both just absurdly powerful cards. The Fire King Snake Eyes deck has infinite one-card starters, much like other versions of the Fire decks. However, I think this one is just the best overall deck, as the Fire King engine by itself is very resilient, very recursive, very strong in terms of going second. It doesn't really have any inherent weaknesses that the other Fire decks have. Additionally, the Snake Eyes cards are just really powerful one-card combos, followed up with the Fire King engine, overall just exceptionally powerful. It's really hard to hand trap this deck post Phantom Nightmare, because there are lines that play around Droll that still do essentially full combo. There are lines that play completely around Nibiru. There are ways to play around Super Polymerization, and it's not really a deck that you can say just easily interact with. So for that reason, I believe this is a deck that's going to be the best deck of the format. It's better than every other Fire deck. But in that being said, let's go to tier 1 now. Next we have Rescue Ace and Rescue Ace variants. So much like everything else, all the Fire decks are gaining immense support. Rescue Ace is a very powerful deck as is. Add even more one-card combos into the deck with the Snake Eye support. Promethean Princess adds another layer to this deck, meaning Effect Veiler and Impermanence on Turbulence are almost irrelevant at this point. So take that into account, that if you use Veiler or Imperm on the Turbulence, they're just going to then link it off and be able to bring it back with Promethean Princess, so you've burnt the Veiler for no reason. If you try to hold the Veiler to when they use it, they're just going to have a Little Knight, so they can just dodge it. If they haven't needed to use Emergency, they can have another way to dodge it. If they're playing Fire Kings in the deck, they have another way to dodge it. So with Kieran, the set 4 with Turbulence is almost always going to resolve. The reason it's in tier 1 below the Fire King Snake Eyes build is just for one reason, that the Fire King the Fire King Snake Eyes build can break a board going second very effectively compared to the Rescue Ace version of the deck. So the set 4, it's not very strong going second, obviously, but like the better Fire deck can break the board going second, so it's just not on the same power level as the deck above it. But that being said, it's still a very powerful deck, and it's almost impossible to stop them resolving set 4. The other Fire deck outside of that is the pure Snake Eyes deck. The Snake Eyes cards are very powerful. They have a lot of resilience to hand traps. They're able to set up both Baron or Borrowed Savage Dragon for negates. So they can set up Omni Negates, which is something the other decks don't really do effectively. They're very resilient in terms they can draw a bunch of cards. They set up the same lines that the Fire King Snake Eyes deck does, but they just don't have the Fire King support there. So instead of going for the Fire King resilience and just setting up a board with interactions and layered interaction, the Snake Eyes deck is more about negating things. But overall, these are like my opinion of the top 3 decks. They're just very, very powerful. Promethean Princess just takes them to a whole nother level of power. And additionally, Populous and Bonfire now become one-card starters in any of these decks. Next, we move to tier 1.5. I'm going to start off with Centurion. So I'm going to put Centurion at tier 1.5. They do get more support, but it's not going to be in Phantom Nightmare, I don't believe. However, they're still able to set up Fire King. They're a Hot Red Dragon King Calamities. So King Calamities is still a unit which is very hard to interact with without the right cards. So that's one problem there. They're able to play the Horus package. The Horus engine is very powerful. I believe that gets new support in Phantom Nightmare as well. Additionally, Centurion is just very easy able to OTK. They're able to play through a lot of hand traps. A lot of board breakers don't really hurt them because of calamities, so keep that in mind. But overall, it's just not as powerful like going second into boards as say the fire decks are. So for that reason, it's going to be tier 1.5 below the fire decks, but still better than a lot of the other decks. Labyrinth, I'm going to put still in tier 1.5. The addition of rollback really helps this deck, although I believe it's just weaker than the others because of something like, say, Ghost Bell. Ghost Bell is a card that really heavily can affect the fire decks now, and it also quite heavily affects the Labyrinth deck being able to Ghost Bell on Big Welcome or Ash Blossom on Big Welcome. However, rollback is a really good addition to this deck to help you play through that, but you still need to have those cards, and it's just not as powerful as the fire deck. The fire deck is able to break a board going second. Labyrinth can kind of have a little bit of trouble depending on the setups. Next, we're going to play Vanadium in tier 1.5. Again, Vanadium is a extremely powerful deck when it goes first. If you resolve full combo, it can be very difficult to break that board. The fire decks do have the ability to break that board through layered interactions, but again, it's still very difficult to beat a Vanadium deck that just went SP Little Knight, Baronne de Fleur, Bestial Dissipator, Chaos Angel with Reframing, and possibly a hand trap in hand as well. That's not exactly the easiest thing to break, but again, it's a combo deck. It plays really well going first, and it's really dice roll dependent. It's not as good going second, which is a big issue, whereas all the fire decks, which are above it, and I know I keep going back to this, but the fire decks are the decks we have to compare everything to. They're good going first or second. And next is Voiceless Voice or Silent Forces, whatever the name of this deck will be in the TCG. I'm putting it here. I feel like this deck, again, is a lot like Vanadium. It's very powerful going first, and if you don't have the correct non-engine for this deck, like being Drolls, Ash, Bell, whatever it might be, this deck is just, it's so difficult to play against. Or at least that's how it feels. However, that could be also just a reason that I'm not super proficient in the matchup yet, and I think I'm probably in the same boat that a lot of players are at. I think as we get more information with this deck and we learn a bit more how to interact with it properly, I think that's when this deck might slip down to that tier 2 strategy, or it could go up to the tier 1 or tier 1 strategies. And they do have a boss monster that can go to 4100 attack, which is really difficult to beat. However, the fire decks do have outs to it, like in the form of like Zelantis setting everything face down. It's really hard to interact with cards that have non-battle destruction and non-targeting abilities. So this deck is, from my opinion, it's probably better than Vanadium as a combo deck if it goes first, because it needs very specific non-engine to interact with it. However, I don't think it's as good as the fire decks because it doesn't play as well going second. For tier 2, I'm going to start with Flu Under Ease. I don't think Flu is a very good deck in general, but I think it's going to be a respectable deck for the deck choice, just based off Shifter and Harpy's Featherstorm, which can just flood the opponent out of the game. But again, it's not the Flu engine which is winning you the game. It's going to be that ability to play the broken non-engine, which can just stop your opponent playing the game. Very similar way I look at Vanquish Soul here. I don't think Vanquish Soul's engine is great, but again, it can make two things. It can play Shifter, that's one, and it has access to Abyss Dweller. Those are the cards which really just turn off the fire decks, and that's what's going to be the most dominant decks, at least from my perspective, in the format. So any deck that has natural counters to the fire deck has a place here, but overall, I don't think the deck is strong enough just in its own engine. I'm going to put Kashtira here as well. Kashtira, obviously, Shifter is a big thing. Being able to play Unicorn and Fenrir to banish things from your opponent's field or extra deck. Most people aren't playing like around Unicorn; they're just playing that one extra deck card. However, again, heavily relies on you being able to draw that non-engine, as well as if I'm not certain if this is a thing, but if people are going to play Zelantis in the extra deck, Zelantis is a card that can heavily affect the Kashtira matchup without very specific cards, so do consider that a thing. But ultimately, Castia is having results right now, and I don't think it's really going to drop off anymore. I think the way it's playing right now is very much how it's going to play post Phantom Nightmare, where you'll see a lot of dimension shifters and and probably even defishers, maybe macros, just ways to help deal with the fire decks. Next, we're going to have Goaty. Goaty's getting more support in the Phantom Nightmare set as well. But again, I'm going to say it's another thing that I don't think it's powerful enough with the engine that it has. It's very recursive. It can flood the field. It can also play Shifter. So again, all 4 of these decks have the ability to play Dimension Shifter. And that's why I'm really thinking about putting these decks in tier 2. But with that being said, you still have to draw the Dimension Shifter to counter the fire decks, and it's a 3 of, but that's not exactly guaranteed to see it every game. So in the games you don't see it, it's really just going to be uphill battle, especially going second. But that being said, these decks still have a way to counter the best decks, so they have something going for them, which is why I would consider them tier 2 contenders. Probably not winning an event, but they can definitely top events, and maybe even one of them will run deep. Salamangreat is another fire deck here. I don't think it's as good as the other fire decks, but again, inherently a fire deck. It has a level 1, so it's going to do something. That's at least my perspective on this, but I could be wrong. I could just be completely off that Salamangreat is irrelevant this format. But again, it's a fire deck that can have an impact in the format, maybe fringe play at regional. Next, I'm going to go with Runic. I still think Runic is a decent engine, or Runic variants of decks are decent, but given the fact that Ghost Spell is going to rise in popularity, Cosmic Cyclone is going to raise in popularity, Ash Blossom is going to be essentially a staple in every deck. Those are just like the natural counters to a Runic deck, as well as the other decks that are built to counter the fire decks are playing Shifter if they can. That's another counter to Runic variants of decks. So I just think Runic right now, it's going to be a struggle because everyone has counters to your deck, and when everyone's having counters to your deck, it may not be the right format for Runic. And then Tier Limits. So Tier Limits is going to be, in my opinion, it's still got the same explosive ability. It has access to a Dweller, and it's exceptionally easy to get to Dweller. The problem is with Tier Limits, from my perspective, is they don't have really any bomb cards. And what I mean by that is they don't have any cards you can say that, wow, that's like the best possible hit you can have right there. If you didn't hit that card, then you wouldn't be winning. They don't have that since the YuGiOh and Kelbeck ban. But Tier Limits is still a strong deck. If they get lucky, if the gamble pays off, this deck can beat any other deck in the format. But that being said, I don't think it's going to have the same consistency that some of the better decks have. Anyways, so that's really the tier list, guys. So that's really the tier list, guys. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Do you agree with my choices? Do you maybe see a different perspective in it? Remember to like and subscribe. I'm Retro YuGiOh, and I'll see you next time.